Hey everybody, time to get to it. Episode 36 of the Far Middle Podcast. Nick DeOlius here. This dedication for episode 36 is going to go to Jerome Bettis, the bus. Now, there are certainly on-the-field reasons that would justify a Jerome Bettis dedication to episode 36. I go back to his time at Notre Dame. I think about all the college football that I watched over my lifetime, which is quite a bit. And the three most dominant players I ever saw live at a game were Derek Thomas when he was at Alabama, Jerome Bettis when he was at Notre Dame, and then LeVar Arrington at Penn State. Those three just completely stood out heads and shoulders above everybody else on the field. You could see it, you could sense it, intimidating in their own individual ways. I go back to Derek Thomas when he was at Alabama. He terrorized my Nittany Lions at Penn State for a couple of years. 1988 was the year, I went back and checked this, Alabama beat Penn State 8-3. That was a score, 8-3. And Derek Thomas was just a one-man wrecking machine. He had 3 sacks, 9 hurries, a safety, but more importantly, he just completely paralyzed the entire offense of Penn State. Very dominant, tragic end to Derek Thomas. What a talent he was. But going back to Jerome and what he did, Notre Dame spoke for itself, just a dominant runner, bruising runner. He gets to the pros, and he just continued to dominate with the Rams, of course, for a lot of years, and then ultimately the Steelers. He finishes his career in a top 10 of all-time career rushing yard leaders. I think he was number 8 currently on that list. A Hall of Famer, of course, deservedly so. That's all the on-the-field stuff. You could go on and on with Jerome Bettis, but the reason I am most focused on him and thinking he's a proper dedication to episode 36 is what he does off the field. You go back to where he grew up in Detroit, and that backstory of his, it's really intriguing. A lot of people don't realize this. He did not start out playing football at a young age. He didn't get into football till high school. He was actually more of a bowler. He loved to bowl more than he did football. But he came across a camp that was put on by another guy who went to his high school before him, Pepper Johnson, another football great, who started a camp to try to give back to the high school and the community that he came from. And Jerome ended up at that camp, took the football. The rest is history from his perspective. And Jerome Bettis will tell you that experience at that summer camp for football, it didn't just sort of set him off in his career. It really opened his eyes throughout his career as he developed and grew as to the impact of getting involved in your communities. And that really was, in many ways, the catalyst for him wanting to do something like that while his career was winding down and post-professional football career, and why he started the Bus Stops Here Foundation. So sort of an interesting backstory there. Another little backstory with Jerome Bettis that ties into some prior content that we've had at the Far Middle Podcast and on the nickdeolius.com website is Joe Moore, Coach Joe Moore, which is a Western Pennsylvania icon, sort of the godfather of offensive linemen on the collegiate level that he coached and developed and trained at Pitt and Notre Dame, and now a whole slew of the who's who of offensive linemen that sort of is the Joe Moore lineage. Today there's an NCAA award, the Coach Joe Moore Award, which goes to the offensive line that's the most exceptional offensive line that year in Division I NCAA football. So it's the only NCAA award that I know of that is actually given to a unit instead of an individual. But Coach Joe Moore, when he was at Notre Dame, coaching the offensive line, he basically was the individual that recruited Jerome Bettis to come to Notre Dame and helped give him and tag him with the nickname of the Bus. So a little bit of a connecting of dots within some characters in Western Pennsylvania that we were able to do there with the Far Middle. And then the Bus Stops Here Foundation, what Jerome is doing with that, providing things like technology to schools, focusing in on middle schools, the kids in those middle schools and those underserved communities. Very impactful, of course. We work quite a bit with his foundation, with the CNX Resources Foundation. That's been an awesome partnership. So, he's been an acquaintance, a friend, a partner, along with his brother, John Bettis, through Bettis Brothers Sand and Gravel. He's good for Detroit. He's good for Western Pennsylvania. And I think he's good as an example as to what people can aspire to be. Now, Jerome, and now we start connecting our dots here, I don't know if you realize this or not, but he was a practicing physicist. He brought physics into action. So what am I talking about here? Well, you see that Jerome made a Hall of Fame career out of applying and maximizing one of those key laws of physics. And that's the equation that I'm talking about of force. So the famous equation, of course, is force equals mass times acceleration. And the bus, he was really good at getting a head of steam up in the backfield on his way to the line of scrimmage. And then he used his M and his acceleration, the A, to apply the maximum force and obviously advance and move the ball forward. He did it time and time again, got to be the best in the business at it. Just ask Brian Urlacher in that snow at Heinz Field for that late season game a few years back. So simple physics, it can get you into the Hall of Fame. Now, equations can be used not just in the area of physics and with football and Jerome Bettis, but also in the arena of economics. And I think a very important equation in the field of economics is explaining the current situation that we're all experiencing when it comes to excessive and rising inflation. Now, monetary economics has a key equation, and that equation is M times V equals P times Y. So MV equals PY. And if you look at the left side of that equation, the MV side, M, that's the money supply, and V is the velocity of money. So M times V is going to equal what's on the right side, P times Y, that's prices or inflation, times Y, which is real GDP, the size of the economy. So let's think through what's happened recently and whether or not it explains inflation under this very crucial formula. First, if you look at the M, money supply has been pumped up substantially by the Federal Reserve. And that was the case before pandemic. Pandemic hits along with the shutdowns that came with it. That also slowed down the velocity of money. People were basically cooped up in their homes. Activity came to a halt or was drastically cut back. So the velocity of money, V, goes down. What happened there? The Federal Reserve, the government, pumped even more M, more money out there. M goes up. So M's going up, V's going down. And if you look at how the extent of this played out, the rate of money supply growth year on year logged the biggest jump on record. So M increased by an amount that was the largest that's been on record. So while M goes up a tremendous level, what happens on the other side of the equation, the right side of it, to balance this off, right? So if M times V equals P times Y, M goes way up to offset a drop in V, what's happening on the right side? Well, real GDP, right, it went down during pandemic, not just because of the pandemic itself, but also because of government shutdowns and government activity that are trying to basically reduce activity in the real economy or the private sector and push out, in some instances, that type of activity and economic endeavor, which is going to affect real GDP. So pandemic and these government-mandated shutdowns, they brought the biggest quarterly drop in GDP ever. So you had this, year-on-year largest increase in M, money supply, on the left side occurring. At the same time, you had the biggest quarterly drop in GDP, Y, on the right side of the equation ever. And when you got real GDP going down by that amount, then P, or prices, they have to go up. And up they went, and they're still going up. And you know what? The simple equation and the math that goes with it, it tells us, if you think through it, there's only two real ways for inflation to abate and to drop. One is you reduce the money supply, M, and that would be the Federal Reserve stopping the buying of assets and to start thinking about things like hiking interest rates. There's been talk of that, right? And there's been some reduction in the rate of buying of assets, but we'll see as 2022 plays out, to what extent actions are going to be consistent with the Fed words. The other way that you can abate or stop inflation is to grow real GDP, have Y go up on the right side of the equation, as in private sector GDP, okay? Not government morass, or DC and Congress injecting themselves and pushing out activity in the private sector, or the administrative state, strangling activity with excessive regulation. Basically, having government get out of the way and let Y, or real GDP, start to grow. That would help abate inflation and the P side of the equation. Now, the concern here is that I doubt either one of those things are going to happen at least as substantially or as quickly as they should, which is going to mean we're going to have more inflation for a longer period of time than we should. And why do I believe that? Why do I think that? Well, first, I don't know. I fear that rates can't be raised by the Federal Reserve, even if they wanted to. And the reason I have that concern is just looking at the math of another matter, which is the federal debt to GDP. Right now, we are north of 125% federal debt to GDP. We haven't seen levels like that since World War II. And the federal government, if you look at that math, can it pay its bills if interest expense on debt starts going up? So if the Fed starts hiking interest rates and raising interest rates, and the cost of all that debt service, the $30 trillion or almost $30 trillion in federal debt, starts to rise appreciably because of higher interest expense, does the math even work? Can the federal government pay its bills? I'm not so sure sitting above 125% debt to GDP that is going to be the case. The second concern I've got with respect to growing real GDP, as I said, that requires government basically getting out of the way when it comes to the private sector and economic activity and value creation. And I don't think government regulation is going to go away. I think it's going to continue to grow and to strangle real GDP in the private sector. Maybe to add insult to injury, the resulting value destruction and pain, oftentimes we've seen this over the past couple of years. I think it'll be the case in the future. It will be used to justify, ironically, yet more government regulation. So regulation that causes damage and destroys value and causes pain, when those things ensue, the government will then turn around and say that now means we need more regulation under the, again, auspices of looking after the common interests or dealing with a problem that in many instances might have been made worse by the government activity to begin with. So hang on. It's going to be, I believe, a rough ride ahead. And saying that the Federal Reserve can't raise rates does not mean that rates won't go up. Just keep that in mind. There's the reality of the market under that equation, M times V equals P times Y, where P is going to do what it's going to do, and whether the Fed wants it to happen or not might be almost ancillary to what actually occurs. Now, I realize, really complicated systems like the United States economy and how it plays out with inflation, sometimes you can't boil it down to a nice, simple, clean, clinical equation that I just articulated, right? That's not the way the real world works. But by the same token, right, there are simple equations that do describe oftentimes the driver or 80% of what's occurring. And I think that is certainly the case when it comes to what we're experiencing with inflation. It's pretty obvious. And if you look at the next dot I'd like to connect, it really speaks to government's most powerful weapon in killing real GDP with overregulation. So this really speaks to the why side on the right side of that equation. Why is real GDP not growing as much as it should? I think everybody knows it's largely driven by government regulation or overregulation. What's one of the most popular sort of components of that overall effort? Climate change policy. Right, so all the buzzwords: code red for humanity, saving the planet, time to act, sense of urgency, on and on it goes. You know them all well by now. If you look at the 2022 agenda for DC and for the current administration, the whispers that we're hearing now in mid to late January are things along the lines of focus being on, and I'm going to use this term now, I want you guys to remember this, the whole of government approach to tackling climate change. Now, you think of that phraseology, whole of government. Few terms make me shudder with apprehension more than the whole of government. I hear that and I immediately start to get concerned, bordering on outright scared. And I read that sort of focal point for 2022, using whole of government to tackle climate change. I read that as more inflation per our prior economics monetary math. A key weapon, I think, in this whole of government approach for tackling climate change, a key weapon I think is going to be using the Fed and the Treasury Department and a host of other federal entities to make climate concerns, and I'm not sure these days what climate concerns mean, right? It could mean anything you want it to mean. That's the beauty of that type of a term. But using climate concerns as part of bank stress tests. And basically, the federal government could make banks manufacture some sort of climate stress scenario to justify the desired outcome, which is reducing lending to domestic energy. I didn't realize this much concentration existed when it came to capital markets, but consider this. There are under 30 banks in the world that constitute 80% of funding to the fossil fuel industry. lending to the fossil fuel industry. And the government bureaucracy, doesn't need to do much. Really doesn't. It's not all that heavy of a lift to control lending flows to this vital sector of the economy, because it's just really a couple dozen banks globally. If you get them to get in line, basically you've achieved what your overarching goals are from a government perspective. Now, what are those objectives, those overarching objectives? I think the government will use these manufactured stress cases and models and scenarios to really achieve two things. First, want to increase the cost of capital, right? Reduce access to capital. So some combination of upping the cost and reducing the access to capital for domestic energy sectors like natural gas and oil. That's clearly one of the overarching objectives. Just make the cost of business much more expensive or shut off access to capital. Second thing it looks to achieve is to push down, sort of suppress the valuations of these types of energy assets in companies and industries. And why are they doing that? It's an attempt to make it toxic, right? The sector, the industry, the company, toxic to investors moving forward. I think those are the two overarching objectives. And using something like climate concerns and the whole of government approach and going after the financial sector as an ends to a means with respect to domestic energy, it could prove to be quite effective, I fear. In many ways, if you just boil this down and look at the essence of it, it is a government-sanctioned assassination of large swaths of sectors and industries that drive this nation's economy and quality of life. All of it, of course, is being justified and wrapped in that nice package that you've got of PhD economists and black box economic models and rigged stress tests and looking after the public interests. Let's go from the topic of climate change and climate change policy, which often entails a lot of rigid and extreme ideology, to another topic that sort of embraces or tends to embrace the same sort of extreme views. And that is the topic of elections and election laws and voting rights. If you take, say, the 2020 presidential election, which we're all familiar with the issues and extreme views surrounding it by now, on one side and one extreme end, you got those who are saying that the election was stolen, that it was rigged, right? The conspiracy theories that go with it, and then all kinds of crazy behaviors that emanate from it. The other side of the extreme spectrum, you got views where there should be no rules, no requirements from whatever ID submission to even being a citizen. There are non-citizens in certain areas of the nation that can vote in elections. So there should be zero rules of the road when it comes to who can vote or how you vote. Now, on either extreme, right, you will hear these arguments that would basically justify or defend the position of voting being a right. And the other side may be saying that voting should be a privilege that comes with responsibilities. Well, I think both of those statements are true. Voting is a right. It should be a right in a democracy like ours, implied right, and that voting is also a privilege. The individual, right, should bear responsibility and view voting as a privilege and the responsibilities that come with it. So how do you come across and set up a system where it's both a right and a privilege? Well, of course, you need reasonable rules of the road, which brought me to an article that I came across about the 2020 presidential election in Time Magazine Online. And the title of this article is "The Secret History of the Shadow Campaign That Saved the 2020 Election." And the reporter or journalist is Molly Ball that wrote this for Time. And I gave this a read, and it sort of pulled me in after a couple of paragraphs. And it pulled me in because, frankly, the best word I can come up with to describe how it made me feel was shocked. This article just shocked me. And Molly Ball, the journalist, she's more left-leaning than me. That's not strange, right? That's common these days for anyone that considers themselves, say, middle of the road like myself versus someone in mainstream media. That's not an unusual thing to see or feel. No, it wasn't that. It wasn't sort of the left-leaning that came across from the reporter or the journalist. Instead, what got me was the tone of the article and the content of it. Those two things together, the tone and the content, again, the best word I can come up with is that it shocked me. So Mrs. Ball is obviously not a fan of President Trump. She was very happy that President Biden won the 2020 election, but her exuberance about that comes through on how she perceives the election was won by President Biden and lost by President Trump. So this really speaks to the gist of what shocked me was how she ascribed the outcome of the election, what actually drove it. And it isn't what she is proposing. It isn't exactly democracy at its finest. So I'll just read you a couple of excerpts from this article, but I encourage you to give it a read. I think you'll find it as interesting and in some ways as shocking as I did. So first, here's one that sort of is at the very front of the article. Quote, "There was a conspiracy unfolding behind the scenes, one that both curtailed the protests and coordinated the resistance from CEOs. Both surprises were the result of an informal alliance between left-wing activists and business titans." So you're starting to hear, the theme here of this sort of alliance, coordination, collusion. I don't know what term you would use for that. She continues further, quote, "The handshake between business and labor was just one component of a vast cross-partisan campaign to protect the election, an extraordinary shadow effort dedicated not to winning the vote, but to ensuring it would be free and fair, credible and uncorrupted." And then, quote, "Their work touched every aspect of the election," end quote. "This is the inside story of the conspiracy to save the 2020 election." It uses the actual term conspiracy, which is never a good word to associate with election, I would think, in a democracy. Another quote here, quote, "It sounds like a paranoid fever dream, a well-funded cabal of powerful people ranging across industries and ideologies, working together behind the scenes to influence perceptions, change rules and laws, steer media coverage, and control the flow of information," end quote. Shocking, shocking stuff to come from a mainstream outlet like Time, and view it in the article clearly as a positive, a thing to be celebrated with respect to how our democracy works, or at least worked from the reporter's perspective in the 2020 election. She also makes mention of AFL-CIO, right, one of the largest, if not the largest, labor union in the country, working with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, right, the biggest business lobby in the land. Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, she pointed out here, and it's accurate, that the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative through Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg chipped in $300 million to basically go to 2,500 local election officials. So the gist of this article was how much coordination, banding together of all these different private interests, businesses, business lobbying groups, labor unions, nonprofits, charities, right? How they all got together and figured out a way or schemed a way to basically throw a significant amount of private money into the election process of this nation, from local polling stations on a municipality level, city level, state level, et cetera, all over the country. And again, this isn't the way that democracy is supposed to work, certainly with respect to our elections, right? If you think about one of the key minimal roles, even if you got more of a libertarian slant towards government, like I may have, one of the key roles that government will always be responsible for is basically setting up an infrastructure and a set of rules of the road when it comes to elections to make sure that they're accurate and fair, and that there's not any sort of gaming going on, from how you cast your vote to how poll stations are run, technology, everything in between. And what you've got here is an article that is effectively a celebration, an outright celebration and an applauding of how a bunch of private interests were funneling hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars into something like a 2020 presidential election, and how it basically helped to significantly impact the outcome. So was any of this stuff true? I'm assuming much of it was. I don't know if it was as true as to the extent that Mrs. Ball infers or implies with her writing. But what does it say about our system of democracy if some of it, or a significant part of it, is true? That should concern Democrats, Republicans, and everybody else in between. Because if you think this was something that was just unique to, say, the 2020 presidential election, or just unique to someone such as a candidate as Donald Trump, I think you're going to be sadly mistaken. I think this has the threat and the risk of becoming the new normal for every election, whether they're presidential elections or non-presidential election, midterm type cycles, or governor seats, or local elections. And that is a trend that we would probably want to avoid if we want to preserve our system of democracy rather than run to it and embrace it and make it the norm. And that actually takes us to our next thought. So you think about who won the presidential election in 2020. So you got President Biden in office, right? We talked about also energy security being eroded by the Fed and the Treasury Department with bureaucrats and what's going on with capital access for domestic energy. So if you take those two things, our current leader in D.C., President Biden, energy security, put them together in the context of geopolitics, what do you have today? You have our president and our country being tested by our adversaries. So you've got Russia and Vladimir Putin, of course. You've got the situation with what's going on there in the Ukraine. And I fear that President Biden is using the same tested yet failed tactics that his old boss, President Obama, used with Putin, which are these threat of sanctions. It didn't work then, and it led to Russia invading Crimea, and occupying it now to this day. And I don't think it's going to work now with the rest of the Ukraine. So the same approach that you saw there with Russia and Crimea, Russia and Ukraine today, you're also seeing it being applied and not working, failing when it came to Iran and its nuclear program, incidentally. So we know it doesn't work across a range of different both timeframes as well as situations. Now, what I'm really worried about is President Biden looking more, say, towards his approval ratings instead of looking towards what is in the best long-term strategic interests of the United States when it comes to things like Iran and its nuclear program and China and Taiwan and the South China Sea. I came across an interesting letter that is written by prior experts and, frankly, prior friends or current allies of President Biden. So this is co-authored by Hillary Clinton, Leon Panetta, General Petraeus. I'm not sure if there were some others, but those three for sure. So people who have dealt and had to lead on the diplomatic and geopolitical stage on behalf of the United States through prior years. And the letter stated that this is in the context of Iran and their nuclear program, that the only way to get Iran to drop the nuclear program is to have a legitimate threat of military strike or military action by the United States if Iran continues to proceed with the program. So the letter goes out of its way to point out that this idea of, quote, all options on the table, end quote, the words, the tough talk of all options are on the table, that is not going to work here. It has not worked with Iran in the past. It hasn't worked with Russia in the past. It's not going to work today with Iran, Russia, or China. And what you need in the case of Iran is Iran to fear, and they use that term to fear, some form of U.S. military action if it doesn't pursue the proper course. So basically the letter's saying words aren't enough. And if you just are relying on words, this is going to end in a bad place when it comes to the United States and our strategic interests. So you've got the president here who's dealing with some approval rating issues, for a whole host of reasons. But one of those reasons is the Afghanistan debacle, which started the bruising, I'll call it, of his approval rating. And the Afghanistan debacle also destroyed our deterrent effect when it comes to dealing with entities and adversaries like Iran. So it's not just approval rating that Afghanistan hurt, it's also that deterrent effect that Clinton, Panetta, and Petraeus were pointing out is so vital in their letter. So does that experience of Afghanistan and the reality of approval ratings, does it impact what President Biden does here and ultimately what Iran decides to do when it comes to their nuclear program? I hope that it doesn't. I hope that we're sort of heeding the words of Clinton, Panetta, and Petraeus and sort of the logic behind it and not worrying as much about what's in the best interest of short-term approval ratings or the next election, and instead worry about what's in the best long-term interests of the strategic positioning of the United States of America. We're just about out of time for episode 36 of the Far Middle Podcast. That went quick. So I'm going to start to wrap things up for this episode. I'm going to start with just mentioning the passing of a great actor, one of my favorite actors, Sidney Poitier, who died at a ripe old age, I think, of 94. So he lived a full life, which is great to see. But he was one of those actors, and much of his work was done before my time, but I got a chance, obviously, to view it on TV and DVD and the like. He's just one of those actors that no matter what the movie was or the subject of the movie was, you just wanted to watch him. So Liam Neeson sort of reminds me of that. Daniel Day-Lewis, is another actor where it doesn't matter what the movie's about, I'm going to watch it if he's in it. Sidney Poitier was one of those actors, just an amazing talent. I believe the first black actor to win an Oscar. I'm pretty sure about that, so that's another sort of note of achievement in that regard. But just had a heck of a career and a heck of a life outside of acting. Had a lot of involvement in the civil rights movement and the March on Washington and all that good stuff. So just thinking about Sidney Poitier and what his life's work represents, looking back on it. And then the other piece of news is the publication date for Precipice. So we've talked about supply chain and supply chain constraints a number of times on the Far Middle podcast. And a lot of the issues in the book Precipice, the left's campaign to destroy America, speaks to things that impact supply chain and value creation and activity. Well, the book Precipice has become another victim of supply chain. And instead of this mid-January publication date that we were set upon, it's been pushed to mid-March because of supply chain issues with the printer. So again, a lot of different areas of the economy and daily life are being affected by supply chain. This stuff matters tremendously. I'm living through one right now. So hang tough. Just a little bit of a delay here in March where we've got the publication date. I believe that new date is up on the Amazon and Barnes & Noble and Indie Books websites. But your pre-orders are still in good shape. If you pre-ordered them, they're still coming. They're just going to be there in March. And if you haven't yet, jump online and do so. I think you'll enjoy it. The topics of this book are more poignant and pressing and tangible today than they've ever been. So I'm really excited about getting it out there and being able to engage and talk to individuals about their thoughts once they had a chance to read it. In the meantime, you can follow me as always on Twitter at Nick DeOlius. Let me know what you're thinking through the website, nickdeolius.com, or you can contact me with a template that's on there, or give me a shout on Twitter if you got some thoughts or views. And in the meantime, stay safe, stay warm in the middle of winter here, and I will talk to you soon with episode 37.